Good afternoon, YouTube. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about watering orchids. So, nice warm afternoon in the greenhouse. We're going to experience a little bit of a rainstorm today and tomorrow and possibly the next day. So I thought I'd get in a video or two before it really starts to rain. It's really windy outside right now, so if you hear some big knocking and stuff, the oak tree above is kind of raining some acorns down on the greenhouse, and I had a chair leaned up against the greenhouse outside, and it's actually blown over since I've been in here, just like a folding lawn chair sort of. So if you hear any extra noises, that's probably what it is. But anyways, let's sort of jump into today's topic, and that's really all it is going to be a topic for more like discussion that we're going to talk about, because it is one of the questions I always hear. How often do I water my orchid? And it's really going to vary. So I have a bunch of orchids in front of me here on this table, and I tried to sort of match them up in pairs just so we can sort of talk about a couple at once. But really the answer, you're going to want to water with room temperature water. You don't want to water with ice cold water. Normally, if you're not fertilizing, you want to really flush the pot well. So you want to take it to the sink and give it a good drink so water flows right through it. A shower is another way to do it. Throw them in the shower stall. After you're done, if there's wet leaves, make sure you put them in an area that has lower humidity or has a fan blowing on there for circulation. You don't want any water getting in the cracks or crevices of the orchid itself, or it could lead to rot and decay. But really, there's no real answer as to how often or when I water orchids. So here in the greenhouse, it's high humidity. Compared to my orchids in the house, I water them less for the same size, for the same orchid. I don't want to even say for the same size pot, because that's not true at all. And that's one of the things, the main thing we're going to discuss today, is you really need to just sort of be able to know your orchid and know when you need to water it. So let's look at a couple plants here. This one here is in Oncidium. It's actually a Culminaria. It has 2 bulbs. It's in a 4-inch pot. Quite a bit of bark in there. This guy here, I water him probably once to twice a week in the greenhouse, even in the summertime. He's not a big plant. He doesn't have a huge root system. He doesn't really soak up the water too much. I see him working on the 3rd pseudobulb here. So with that being said, here is another plant. This is an epidendrum. It is in a 4-inch pot as well. One's round, one's square. But this plant here is much bigger for the same size pot. It has many more roots for the same size pot, and you can even see the roots. They're pushing out against the side a little bit. You can see some air roots coming out, and there's basically there's roots everywhere on this plant. I can water this every 2nd day, and it's dry again 2 days later. So that's really what you're looking for, is you want to water most orchids, and I say most because some are different, but as they're approaching dryness, just before they're bone dry, but after they're no longer really wet to the touch. If you can dig your finger sort of way into the media and it stays and comes out pretty dry, maybe just slightly damp, there's a good time to usually rewater most orchids. So this guy here, compared to the first one, he gets rewatered almost twice as much. Now let's look at a Cataleya. This is a beautiful Cataleya, not quite in bloom yet, but 3 good buds on it. I've had this for a few years now. I got it as a seedling. It's even got a 2nd growth coming out, and it's coming along nicely. You can see a fair amount of roots coming off the bulbs. And this guy here, he sits on the top shelf. It's quite warm. I probably water him twice a week. At the end of that, the media is getting dry again. We don't want, although when we see wet roots, you can tell they've recently been watered because the roots usually change color. You don't want to see that day after day. If they're constantly wet, you're overwatering. But if we look at this plant, and now we look at this one here, which is also in a 4-inch pot, the difference between how much water this takes in a 4-inch pot and how much the last one takes is crazy. This guy here can be watered basically daily with no issues at all. A few hours later, all the roots have soaked up all the water and they're starting to almost look dry again. Sits basically right beside the other plant, but completely different amount of water it's going to bring in just purely on the root mass itself. So if you have 2 orchids exactly the same on the top, but the roots are different. Maybe one has really good roots and one has rotten roots. Maybe you've been overwatering the one that has rotten roots to start with, but it certainly is not going to soak up the water that its neighbor is. Just like this one compared to the other one, they don't soak up the same amount of water at all. Here is another example. So this is probably a 5-inch net pot. I just actually replanted this one, and it has 4 pseudobulbs that are in active growth, another 3 that aren't. It sits nicely in the middle of this pot. It had a modest root system, and it's packed with a lot of moss in there. This guy is really not going to need to be watered, probably more than once a week. Even though it's a net pot and has plenty of air circulation, this guy I think is good about once a week at this point. Now I'm going to bring up another one. Very similar orchid. Here is a Stanhopea orchid in the exact same pot, exact same size pot, exact same potting media. There's moss in there with some bark. This one has an uncountable amount of bulbs in it, and I can't keep it's bone dry right now as we speak. I watered it last night. I can't keep this one wet enough. So here's an example of an orchid that A, needs to be repotted, B, probably needs to be divided into 2 or 3 or 4, and C, I could basically give this one enough water. I could water it every day. I can never overwater this plant, I feel. It would just love me for it. You can see some of the bulbs are even shriveling from a lack of water. Even though I water this, I try to hit it with water every single day. So there's another great example of 2 plants, similar care, similar media, different size root system, different size plant in the same pot, needing 2 completely different types of watering regime. And for my last example here, I am going to bring out a little Dracula orchid. He's in a net pot. It's probably a 3-inch pot. It's just a recent division I took, and it's got a little root system. It's got 5 or 6 growths on it. This guy here, although Draculas like to be nice and moist all the time, he doesn't need to be rewatered that often. It would take a good week, maybe 10 days before this guy dried out here in the greenhouse because of the humidity. So I have to be very careful with this little Dracula, not to give him too much water, because I don't want him always sitting in water. Now I will show you another Dracula in a very similar size pot. Just finishing blooming, lots and lots of buds and blooms still to come. Same size pot, same media. Look at the difference in the plant. This is another plant that I have to water daily or else it's bone dry. It's just amazing the difference. So the moral of this little story or discussion is really when somebody asks, how often do I water my orchid? You can never really give them an honest and exact answer. You can give them some rules of thumb, but to be able to tell them water it once a week with this much water is ridiculous, because it will never happen. In your home, your temperature is going to be different than mine, your humidity is going to be different, your plant size is going to be different, your root size is going to be different, everything about it, there's going to be many variables. So what you basically have to do is do your own research, find out what kind of watering your plant, your orchid needs, whether it likes to completely dry out before watering like some dendrobiums, or never likes to dry out like this Dracula orchid here. And then you're going to have to adjust your watering schedule to that plant and make sure you water as required, because these 2 plants, they have the exact same care. If I said to water this plant with a 1/4 cup of water daily, this one's going to be fine, and maybe need even more than that. This one is going to be absolutely flooded. If I said water this with a 1/4 cup of water weekly, this one's probably going to be fine, and this one is going to be dry as a bone for 6 days of the week. So, long story short, make sure you adjust your watering for your own orchids. It's really hard for somebody else to answer the question, how often do I water orchids? When you really have to take everything like this into account and water it as needed. Now, one tip that I have for you, and I do this here in the greenhouse, is although I have different sections, hot, cold, that sort of thing, and most plants are grouped together in that section, I also group the plants that need more water together, or I remember which ones need more water so that I know which ones to water more often. So I can go to different parts of the greenhouse and water them at different times. I know, for example, the masdevallias on the bottom row here, they really only need a good soaking once a week or so. The Dracula orchids up here, they're different than the Dracula orchids down below. They are bigger in their pots and need a little bit more water. The shelves over here dry out much faster and need more water than the shelves directly behind you. The Cataleyas, although they're all on one shelf, I can tell, I kind of have them memorized because I know my plants, as to this one needs lots of water, this one hardly needs any water at all. And again, it's not necessarily the pot size and the root size doesn't make all the difference. Some plants just simply don't need as much water. It goes with Nepenthes as well. Now, this plant here, this is my Nepenthes densiflora. There's 2 plants in there. This one, every time I turn around, is basically bone dry. If you have a sunny afternoon, this plant is so light that I can feel that there's hardly any water left in it whatsoever, which is dangerous for a Nepenthes. This one is a Burbigii, or Burbigiae. There's 3 plants in this pot, exact same size pot. I can water this one once a week and it is just fine, even though it's in the same greenhouse and gets the same attention and care. Hardly needs any water whatsoever. I think the roots in these 3 plants are much smaller than the roots in those 2 plants up there, and they simply don't take up as much water, or the plant itself just simply doesn't need as much water, isn't transpiring as much, isn't soaking up as much as the one beside it. So anyways, I hope this little talk has kind of made you think about how much you need to be watering your orchids. Make sure you do your research, figure out how much water the orchid needs, and then sort of adjust it on how it feels. A good way to tell when you're working with one plant is weigh it, or just get a feel for it, what it feels like when it is watered, and then get a feel for what it's like when it's dry. If you think that it can go one more day without water, you are likely right, and you can probably push it. If you know that no way that needs water, it's probably time to water it. So any doubt, leave it another day, and go from there. So I hope you like this little video, this discussion on how we water orchids, or when we water orchids. No real exact answers. It kind of makes you think for yourself. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks for watching.